You are like a wild animal. You are in the last months of your life. You do not deserve to breathe the air on earth, nor see the light of the Lord. You shall disappear from this world and never reappear in it again. The shadows will envelop you, and you will find time to repent your bestial life.
Rude.
That is a quote from the prosecutor of Elizabeth Bathory, also known as Countess Dracula. Her legend was the inspiration for the first widespread vampire in fiction, which wasn't Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was Carmilla, created by Sheridan Le Fanu. And before we get too deep into this, a mutual friend of ours, Alan, requested that I make it explicitly clear ahead of time that there are diverging historical reports on this woman. By the way, it belongs in a museum. I forgot to say that until now. And we're going to discuss whether or not this tale, this legacy, belongs in a museum. And we're also going to look at, what could have been exaggerated. What can history glean from this? We're going to talk about some of the people involved and, you know, diverging opinions on what could have happened. And the main source we're drawing from, although I've looked at other sources in research, is this book right here, The Most Evil Men and Women in History by Miranda Twist. So, without further ado, let's get into the tale that inspired modern vampirism, shaped pop culture hundreds of years later, the story of Elizabeth Bathory, also known as Countess Dracula. Elizabeth was born in 1560 in Transylvania.
Already touching on some notes.
Her father George was a minister who married his cousin Anna. The illustrious family tree contained a number of war heroes as well as a cardinal and a future king of Poland. But she also had some strange relatives, perhaps the result of constant intermarriage among the few Hungarian noble families. One of Elizabeth's uncles was reputedly addicted to rituals of satanic worship, and her Aunt Clara was a well-known bisexual who enjoyed torturing her servants, and Elizabeth's brother, Stephen, was a drunk and a lecher. Many members of Elizabeth's family showed signs of epilepsy, madness, and psychological disturbances, and as a child, Elizabeth was prone to frequent fits in which she would become overcome with rage and uncontrollable behavior.
Like, already we're past the point of the Fall of the House of Usher, level of crazy.
Um, so, all right. There are I should have said this earlier. This is going to involve talking about things like torture and blood and death. So if that's something you don't want to hear, don't listen. And if it's something you don't want other people in the room to hear, put in headphones. I am going to dance around some of the gnarlier tidbits, just because the detail this book goes into is not fit for most platforms, even educationally. If you like this, the book is very interesting so far from what I've read of it. Around the age of 6, Elizabeth witnessed an event which would allegedly leave a lasting impression. Again, these are all based on witness testimonies at the time, journals they had.
And potentially historical exaggeration.
Yes. During a band of gypsies were invited to the home, because it's a big castle, to provide entertainment at the court. During their stay, one of their number was accused of trying to sell his children to the Turks. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. His long cries echoed through the castle, ensuring Elizabeth's attention, and at dawn she escaped from her room and ran outside the castle to witness his punishment, which she was not supposed to do. I'm going to put this in as safe for school terminology as I can. You remember the tauntaun? And Elizabeth saw that and said, "Hell yeah." She was 6. Elizabeth was an exceptionally intelligent woman. She was fluent in Hungarian, Latin, and German at the time, when even the ruling prince of Transylvania was barely literate.
So, Hungarian, Latin, German, as in the 3 languages that we give to villains when they're summoning demons.
I mean, if it works, it works. All modern fiction has some origin in history, whether it be through myth or fact.
Which just means that people like this come out as cartoon characters.
Yeah, yeah. Let's see. She had learned from an early age that she could be ruthless and disobedient as long as she did so to peasants.
Okay, I'm gonna pause real quick. Because I'm still not recovered from the tauntaun.
And that was the nice version of that story,
by
the way.
Who comes up with
Oh,
that?
yeah, Transylvanian Hungarian justices in the 1500s was not something to dabble with.
Like
I haven't read this author's take on Vlad the Impaler's
the fact,
history, but my God,
the fact
it
that,
can't be worse.
well, you say that.
Okay, we need to keep the story rolling. Um, at an age when most children learn to control their aggressive tendencies towards others, Elizabeth was under no such constraints, and in 1571, when she was 11, one of her cousins became the ruling prince of Transylvania. 2 years later, when the peasants rose in rebellion, he ordered, yeah, the 54 suspects, they had bits of themselves pruned off and then were hung from the gallows. That's the nice way of me putting that. So, she's not growing up around kindness.
So these people are pulling the legs off spiders, so to speak, but they're people.
It was people were reverse engineering the Mr. Potato Head experience, as how I would describe it. Anyway,
Uh,
later that year, Elizabeth became engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy. I'm sure I'm not saying that correctly. Sorry, family. The Black Hero of Hungary, who was a cruel and ruthless warrior.
that says something.
He was born in 1555 of noble birth, but not as wealthy a lineage as the Bathories. He had attended school in Vienna, but was not a good student, although he was a fine athlete and popular amongst his peers. Elizabeth was developing fast. She liked to dress in men's clothes and play men's games. Unfortunately, she became pregnant by a local peasant. When she gave birth, her bastard daughter was given away to a peasant with the assurance that she would never reappear during Elizabeth's lifetime.
Does that person ever reappear?
No.
So that person got a happy ending.
The happiest of these stories is that one, yes. At the age of 15, she married the 21-year-old Nadasdy on the 8th of May in 1575 at Verano Castle. It was a spectacular wedding in which the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian was invited. He did not attend because of the distances involved, but he sent a delegation and an expensive wedding gift, which, you know what, honestly, I know some weddings where they prefer that. But here's the interesting backstory of Ferenc. He was a soldier who spent much of his time away from home fighting the Turks. He was one of 5 sharp-sabered heroes known as the Unholy Quintet, who inspired fear in the enemy. Elizabeth was less in charge of Castle Savar, the Nadasdy family estate in Hungary. Already a renowned beauty, she had also acquired the reputation for cruelty to her servants. She
So,
relished her power and ran the estate like a torture chamber. She had innumerable lovers, both men and women, and anyone found trespassing on her land would not be expected to leave.
okay, so we're gonna peel back the layers on this. Uh, what did the Unholy Quintet do?
They were warriors.
Okay,
They were like the
look,
elite special
but they were
forces of
fighting
this.
amongst other warriors.
Hmm.
There has to be a
You're
reason
you're
you
gonna
can.
get some more. Well, they were very talented swordsmen. They were violent. They were scary. Also, if you got captured, so this is a big point of difference, but also some overlap. But I don't want to spoil
Okay,
something
all
that's
right.
coming up.
Next layer. She had a whole bunch of
For
lovers.
the first 10 years of their marriage, Elizabeth had no children because she and her husband were rarely together. Then, around 1584, she bore a daughter, Anna, and over the following 9 years, gave birth to 2 more girls, Ursula and Katerina, or Katharina, and in 1958 bore her first and only son, Paul.
Like Paul. Like all the other ones are Katerina and Ursula, and you got Paul.
Yeah. Judging by letters written to her relatives, Elizabeth was a very protective mother.
You don't say.
You know what? It's better to be a protective mother than a horrible, violent
I
one.
could see the picture of her. She definitely has the vibe of a Karen.
She, yeah,
Like the
she.
hair just has no movement to it.
Well, it's a oil painting.
You
Oh,
know,
because it's bound up. I understand what
yeah.
you're saying.
Did you not under?
To kill some time, besides admiring her own beauty, she began to visit her lesbian aunt, Countess Carla Bathory, and to participate in orgies. Elizabeth then realized when her true passion lay, the inflicting of pain on large-bosomed young girls.
Okay, pause. Okay. So I don't want this to be a 5-hour podcast, but
Well, look,
I can't. My brain is so much like, all right, you only have time to talk about one of these things, and it cannot pick the going to orgies with your aunt, the no one's expected to leave your house, love torturing people. the whole bunch of lovers, men and women, while your husband is off doing whatever.
So the husband's about to re-enter the story. Uh, she also developed an interest in the occult. She met Dorothy Santes, a black magic witch who encouraged Elizabeth's sadistic tendencies.
Oh, that did not need to be encouraged.
No, Dorothea and Elizabeth's servant Thorco instructed Elizabeth in the ways of witchcraft, which she wrote to her husband about. And when I was reading this, I thought, oh, so her husband's gonna be like, oh my god, she's insane.
Yeah, which, uh, the letters have to be like, so on my way back from my ant orgy.
So there's a little bit of it here. Thorco has taught me a lovely new technique. You catch a black hen and beat it to death with a white cane. Keep the blood and smear a little of it on your enemy. If you get no chance to smear it on his body, obtain one of his garments and smear it on that.
And what does that do? I mean, it puts blood on him.
I think it's like a curse, like a hex. Elizabeth's husband was, by all accounts, a vicious man whose principal hobby was the torture of servants. So he began to teach his cruel and promiscuous wife the subtle art of inflicting pain. She took on, I like this sentence, Elizabeth took on her education with monstrous zeal. So there's a couple things that describe what they did to people, and I'm not going to go into it because
if I think about the term monstrous zeal, the closest I can think is like Mythbusters' approach to science.
Yeah. So there's certain ones like it involves like nudity and honey and bees, or like lit wax paper between someone's toes, or like hot coins and needles and things. So we're not going to get into the nitty gritty. Let's just say that people didn't fake illnesses ever again, or call in sick to work. There was a lot of that stuff.
Jeez.
So
there's so many things that I want to be like, pause. Let's dissect how awful this is. But I know that.
So I would say that
because I could see the tabs in the book, and I know
that was like, the rising action.
We're halfway through.
That was the rising action. Well, it's not linear. Things escalate quickly.
And I'm aware that you're skipping over a lot of the.
It's a fascinating. I had to stop midway through reading it to like take a walk. It was a lot to process.
And you're one of those people who still has social media.
Near the close of 1603, Ferenc suddenly became ill. That's her husband, and died on the morning of the 4th of January, 1604, apparently by poison.
Oh, I was about to be like, oh, what a loss. Sorry, but of course, she killed him, didn't?
Well, not confirmed. That's in history, there are many loose threads.
I'm going to be honest. It's hard to think.
They seemed happy.
Anyway. She liked inflicting pain on others. She found that out by going to ant orgies.
Anyway, you got to get over the ant orgy thing.
It's just, like, it's such a step. Like, you feel like there should be escalation to that, like going to normal orgies where you don't know anyone. I say normal orgies. That's what this book, like, that's
anyway, rather than
story's done to me.
Rather than curtailing Elizabeth's cruelties, Finnick's death was just the beginning.
You don't say. What did she did she invent the railroad just to tie women to it?
Only 4 weeks later, Elizabeth decided that she had been mourning long enough and moved to Nadesteam Mansion in Vienna. She began making appearances at court, much to the horror of Rudolph, the Holy Roman Emperor, who found her brazen. But most of her time, Elizabeth lived at Castle Cathtis, a forbidding fortress high above the river Va. The castle contained a vast labyrinth of caves that would later bear witness to the worst of her atrocities.
Okay, so she has an evil cave underneath her
cave system, multiple caves.
She has a cave network underneath her castle.
From what I
believe, is built on a do we have photos of what this castle looked like?
I will include.
Or was it
in this?
Was it destroyed?
There were some renovations done to it in the midst of this story, but that's a spoiler. No. I would argue. Well, it's Transylvanian justice, but it is justice.
Well, okay. Okay, I thought she was the one doing the renovations, being like, we're going to need a lot of meat hooks.
Well, so another thing that she used to do whenever she was bored, I forgot, I left it out. She would have women, servant girls, which was the thing, stripped naked out in the cold during winter, and she would, from her very tall place in, the whatever store she was in, pour down water on them and watch them freeze into frozen statues for the rest of the winter, and she would gaze out at her beautiful statues.
I haven't seen Frozen 2.
Yeah, sorry. Elsa takes a dark turn.
Okay. So
the song they wrote for it is very catchy.
I don't think
what can't she do?
Okay, hold on. I want to briefly. What's going on with the kids? Do we know?
They're not really brought up more in this. I think they're off in schools and just largely left out of the historical kerfuffle, and largely
Tho-
not part of the legacy that it leaves
those
behind.
school counselors have their work cut out for them.
Look. Let's just keep trucking, all right? Jeez, it's like you have no format for the dramatic. There's a
I
pacing to it.
need to know this.
Routine
There's.
torture was not the limit of Elizabeth's excess. In 1604, an enigmatic figure, Anna Dervalia, came into the Countess's life. This wild beast in human form taught Elizabeth many new techniques of torture and became one of the most active sadists in her entourage, which I guess is what the show Entourage is about. Darvalia made it her business to know everything about everyone in Elizabeth's service. She insisted on taking only girls who have not yet tasted the pleasure of love, and most importantly, only peasant girls, which is a point that will come up later in this story. But Bathory was a woman of insane beauty. She had raven long hair, which contrasted with her milky complexion. Her amber eyes were almost cat-like, and her figure was voluptuous. And yet, her beauty was beginning to wane with the ravages of time. She tried to conceal the decline through cosmetics and expensive, elaborate clothes, distractions. We've seen celebrities. This is before plastic surgery. These could not conceal the ever-spreading wrinkles. Then, a minor household incident inspired the Countess to pursue her love of death with renewed vigor.
She already had monstrous zeal.
Well, yeah, but her husband has died. She's moved to Vienna. She's hanging out with the Holy Roman. Like she's doing stuff. She's got her witches and sadists, and eventually, we'll get into it. It's yeah. Um, she had a servant girl attending to her hair, and there's conflicting reports whether the person she pulled on her hair too hard while fixing her hair, or remarked that something was wrong with the headdress. The infuriated countess slapped the girl so hard that blood spurted from her nose, and the blood splashed against Elizabeth's face. Where it touched her skin, the countess observed in the mirror that a miracle had seemingly occurred. To her eyes, the skin had lost its lines of age. I mean, it's probably just hydrated.
Well, or
she's insane.
Or her white skin then had blood on it, and the blood distracted from the wrinkles.
Anyway, Elizabeth,
Like, she should have tried wearing, like, geek glasses.
was exhilarated by the knowledge she could regain her lost youth. Her witch, Dervolia, instructed the credulous Elizabeth on how she might again be young. She believed the ancient credo that taking another's blood could result in the assimilation of that person's physical or spiritual qualities. So, yeah, reports say that she had a room where she would do her, hey, I need your blood things. And after they had done this to the people, they would then take like ash and soot and cover where the blood had been. Like they were like making it so the next people who walked in didn't know. Although you're locked in a castle, your options of escape are pretty limited. But she recruited her old nurse, Luna Ju, her faithful servant Fisco, and Darvolia and Dorothea to kidnap and kill more young girls on the pretext of hiring them as servants.
Like,
yeah, that's an interesting detail, but I think it's too gory for this. But needless to say that according to reports, she would see the speed in which people passed away and would be like, oh, because she's smaller, she had less blood. And she was basically advancing medical science and by just surrounding herself by a copious amount of death. She became medically a savant, but only in drawing out as much time with the victim as possible.
I just need you to verbally confirm this. She does die at some point in this story, right?
That is what the legend says.
I hate you.
Oh yeah, even whenever she was too ill for the tortures continue, she would have people brought before her in her bed so she could sit up in bed and attack, which is where the first time of her being so upset she couldn't do it, she stood up in her bed and went from looking deathly sick to ravenously insane and bit someone on the neck to draw their blood. And you're beginning to see now where these ideas of vampirism and
I'm gonna be honest,
cult
I
culture.
lost mental track of the vampirism. I was just like, this person is the devil.
Over a period of 10 years, well over 600 young girls disappeared throughout the land. There was a whole situation where she disappeared. Apparently, she was pretty brazen about disposing of bodies. She'd throw bits of them out over here. She'd put them over there. And in one case, someone was too weak to carry it out, and they started stinking. And so then they had to hire these other people. So they just threw them behind the rutabagas. And they were like, whatever. Although initially she initially would give all of her victims a Christian burial, but oh yeah, here we go. At least initially, she enlisted the aid of the local Lutheran pastor Andreas Bertoni, but when he was presented with two girls whose veins had been split open and drained of blood, he refused to perform his duties because too many were coming to him who had died in, quote, unknown and mysterious circumstances. Day after day, month after month, year after year, Elizabeth continued to relish in the blood of young girls, and yes, she would bathe in a bath filled with blood, which is kind of like the money shot of all of the movie and TV adaptations of this, except for the ones that portray her as a victim of narrative who was actually just caught in political intrigue, which we'll get to that political intrigue here in a second.
Okay, now I'm gonna pause. Like
My God,
I know
we're gonna call this the pause.
this ain't about her now. How can you read any amount of these allegations, like allegation after allegation after allegation, getting progressively worse in more creative and horrible ways,
Mm-hmm.
and then be like, well, maybe it's a misunderstanding.
No, so our mutual friend Alan, he heard a totally different version of this when he was in college, and I want to talk about what he heard. I want to talk to you about what this Cambridge professor believed, although I think that Cambridge professor is a little off it. And the author of this book even says that history may fall in between the two lines of extreme innocence and extreme guilt. In between the two is usually where the truth lies. So we're gonna get to that, but that's
I mean,
the resolution.
There's enough reports of like this Lutheran guy and
So,
like,
but there are interesting stories, so I want to get into it. Um, but yeah, apparently she would like toss people out of like body parts. Like she just became more flippant, and she would like in company of people, like in popular spaces, like she'd be at like a big party and be like, "Ha ha ha ha! Did you know that I did this to a servant girl?" Whoa. But she was like a noble. You literally could not do anything to her. Like she had like diplomatic immunity functionally. Darvolia had always stressed the importance of using only peasant girls. You remember that was her witch, who had no recourse. But Darvolia was becoming increasingly incapacitated by blindness and epilepsy, and Elizabeth had started to lose all sense of aristocratic decorum. When Darvolia died, Elizabeth found herself aging even more. Shock. Then another sorceress, Urzia Majorova, told her that virginal victims must be of noble birth. So she began to collect some girls from the surrounding local nobility, but it wasn't easy because no one wanted to send their noble children to some crazy chick's castle because like rumor was spreading, and also like why would you? Your daughter's a noble. You want to keep her safe until you can marry her for political gain.
At this point in time, does she have the like local reputation of she kills people
among peasants? Yes.
Then why are people still like, well, she's offering?
If you're starving in the gutter, the idea of a warm meal before you're tortured is sometimes enough. Desperation, and they would start going to further and further.
Now, I guess she was employing people to kidnap people.
There was a really good sentence in here, and I think we already passed it. It was really funny.
Funny?
Yeah, this author has a dark sense of humor about it.
I don't like this story.
Oh, yeah. The Countess's practices, as rumors spread about the Countess's practice, only the brave, foolhardy, or desperately poor could be lured to her services. Her cohorts would often have to go to distant villages and offer increasingly high prices to recruit the girls. Murder is, after all, an expensive business. It's a little cheeky. That's fun. I have a little fun with it. So that was it made me laugh. But yeah, so basically people were like, we're not gonna keep sending people to you, and the sheer number of murders Elizabeth had committed were beginning to tally against her. Sometimes a mother of a murder victim would inquire about what happened to her daughter, like Anna Gonsky, who had heard. Also, there's a victim in here I want to recognize as just a total hero and a Chad at one point, because I think they should be immortalized forever. But they wouldn't show her the body except the telltale signs of torture on it. The woman persisted until threatened by Elizabeth's officials. Only later would Anna realize the full horror of her daughter's last moments. Her power made her virtually unassailable when a new pastor, the Reverend Janos, oh boy, it's one of those very Polish names, Ponekanus, investigated the subterranean passages between the church and the castle. He found 9 boxes containing the mutilated remains of recently murdered girls. No one had even bothered to nail the boxes shut. He reported the discovery to a superior, the Reverend Elias Lagny, calling the Countess Bathory the worst killer under the sun in terms of evil, not in ineptitude. His report never reached its destination. The Countess's henchmen intercepted it.
I assume this is what Game of Thrones is, of just like
Oh, this is so much better written.
like the oh, this person has to get their comeuppance. It's like nope.
Anyway, despite her great wealth and extensive properties she had inherited largely through her own family, Elizabeth was always complaining about a lack of money. It had been common practice among the Hungarian nobles to finance their knights, usually out of their own pocket. The crown very rarely had the cash, and Ferenc, her late husband, lent a large amount of money, 17,408 gulden, to King Matthias. After her husband's death, Elizabeth had been trying to ensure the Hungarian king honored his debts to her husband. She needed the money for a rather expensive pastime. I love the way they worded that. As rumors spread about the Countess's practices, only the brave, and that's when we get
Like
it.
I think, as far as annoying letters to get, the hey, you owe my dead husband money. Give me money so I can keep murdering
I
people.
don't think she would have put it in such plain words, but
Like, but that is what happened.
oh, the sun is coming out. How nice!
Dude,
It's pretty. It's been a little
quit being
overcast.
pleasant.
Elizabeth resorted to selling two of her family castles. The crown purchased the first, Theban Castle, an important frontier fort, and second, Beckhoff, was pawned for 2,000 gulden. By this time, the rest of her family were fully aware of Elizabeth's tendencies. Her cousin, Count Thurzo, Palatine Prince of Transylvania, gathered the rest of the clan together and arranged for Elizabeth to leave Cathtis Castle, sojourn into Verano, and there be spirited off to a convent where she would, quote, would end her days. Several days before his plans could be put into action, however, Count Thurzo learnt that Emperor Migert, these words, had registered a formal complaint against Elizabeth before the Hungarian parliament. The parliament was to listen to the testimonies and accusations against the countess for 3 days. Times were changing, not in Elizabeth's favor. The lawlessness and extraordinary power of the nobles was coming to an end as the Holy Roman Emperor, the Archduke Matthias II, was determined to restore order. Yay! Good things are happening now. The Archduke started an investigation of his own into Elizabeth Bathory. Gabor Bathory, a cousin of Elizabeth's, wanted to dispose of King Matthias II and expand Transylvania and absorb some of the empire's lands into his own, which is where the political intrigue comes in. And many people who argue against this current narrative that we're reading through argue that it was actually all a political smokescreen used to seize her lands to ensure power for one kingdom or another.
Oh, the poor thing. I'm sure he just made up the 600 frozen bodies.
Well, they weren't all frozen, and we're going to get into it.
And like her entourage of witches.
Her family, fearing they would lose their property rights if she was found guilty of crimes warranting the confiscation of their estates, became active accomplices in her capture and subsequent trial. From the end of March 1610 to beginning of July, the testimonies of 34 witnesses were recorded, some of who were nobles. It was in Matthias's interest to destroy Elizabeth. If she were to be found guilty, her property would be confiscated, and most importantly of all, her claims to the debt which the crown owed her would be void. Finally, we're going to call him Pony. Reverend Pony managed to get his report to Count Thurzo. The title Palatine allowed Thurzo to act with the full authority of the king in his absence. But he was in a very delicate position. As the widow of one of the leading lords of the realm, Elizabeth could not be arrested without a special act of parliament. Under pressure from the Hungarian Catholic nobles, parliament was summoned to a place that I cannot pronounce, Hungary's temporary capital after Budapest had fallen to the Turks. The nobles listened to the complaints and testimonies. They were particularly indignant that Elizabeth had indulged in her barbaric acts on girls of noble birth and not only peasant girls.
Oh, what a radical change that
But
makes.
Count Thurzo was in a quandary.
Oh.
In the midst of his attempts to find some face-saving device and preserve Elizabeth's properties from confiscation by the king, an emissary from King Matthias arrived, asking Thurzo to go to Castle Cathis to find out facts and punish the guilty by royal command, which is like the setup to a great Inquisitor novel. Thurzo wanted to handle things to the Bathory family's advantage, so he planned his visit to Elizabeth's castle to coincide with the Christmas holiday when the Hungarian parliament was not in session. By December of 1610, Elizabeth was aware that the net was closing in, and she took steps against her plotters. So she concocts, long story short in this, she concocts a potion that involves bathing in water and baking the bath water into a cake, and then she tests it and she fed it to some servant girls to see if it would kill them like it should, and so they got tummy aches, and so she didn't try that again because it turns out witchcraft doesn't work.
Hey, there could be Wiccans listening to this.
And you know what? If they have proof that it works, then congratulations, that's the scientific method. More power to you. Elizabeth's last victim, Dorixa, who is a damn hero. I want this woman memorialized in Transylvania and everywhere else, was a buxom, powerfully built girl from Croatia. Accused of stealing a pear, the girl was ordered to appear in the laundry room. Once she arrived, the usual home justice began. The girl was first made to undress, then had her hands tied behind her back because she's built like an ox. Elizabeth then beat her with a club, but Deriska refused to die, and over the course of her beatings, Elizabeth had to repeatedly change her clothes because of the blood being splashed on it, and Deriska still refused to die. Even the peasants who were being forced to beat her for Elizabeth were getting tired and were dropping because they were exhausted from malnourishment trying to kill this giant. Deriska was a real one. Finally, at the end, she was stabbed with scissors and died, but she clung on to life, refusing to die for days, exhausting others to the point that even Countess Elizabeth Bathory was exhausted and unable to continue the beatings for hours and days. I just want that person memorialized. Of all of this, that's hardcore. Your legacy lives on. I want Deriska belongs in a museum. Anyway, on the night of the 30th of December, the castle was raided. The group moved rapidly through the main courtyard. Then Count Thurzo stumbled over something in the dark. It was the body of a young girl. Once inside the building, he descended down 150 feet to be confronted by an iron-spiked door. Inside, the air was damp and fetid. Great word, fetid. But through the haze, he noticed a 50-year-old woman crouched over a stool. When she turned to him in a state of frenzy, Thurzo realized it was Elizabeth. "You shall pay for this intrusion," she shouted. "Not so, my lady," he responded. "This is not one of your servants, but the Palatine Prince of Hungary, who has come to bring justice to those accursed walls." Meanwhile, the Count's companions crowded into the room to survey the carnage. Elizabeth's cohorts were rounded up, and Elizabeth was dispatched to her room. Inside the castle, the authorities found the body of one dead girl in the main room, drained of blood, a bowl of blood in the other, and girls imprisoned in the dungeons, pierced with holes, but still alive. Hence the being bit by vampires parts of mythology solidified forever. Her final trial began on the 2nd of January in 1611, which, we're in January when I'm recording that. Became a huge public event and was a packed gallery, was shocked to hear the detailed accounts of the Blood Countess's gruesome tortures and the pleasures she received from it all. Count Thurzo had already secretly arranged that Elizabeth would not be brought to trial. The Countess was tried purely on a criminal basis, while her cohorts in terror were charged with vampirism. They were found guilty of vampirism. That was a punishable crime at this point, and frankly, if I lived at the time, I would also say, of course they must be vampires. What non-vampire would do these things? Witchcraft and practicing pagan rituals, although they likely did praise them as well. The testimonies of her 4 accomplices were taken and their sentences pronounced. The testimonies of the 4 placed the body count at between 30 and 60. But a 5th witness revealed the missing piece of the puzzle. The witness was called Susanna, and she revealed the single most shocking piece of evidence in the trial, a list and register in the Countess's chest of drawers, which put the number of girls killed at 650. The list was in the Countess's own handwriting. Elizabeth and her cohorts had kept a detailed list of their own crimes. Local woman Erzy Majorova was sentenced to death for taking the bodies from the Countess and disposing of them for a fee. Ilna June and Doretha Sensis were sentenced to have all of their fingers, which they had used as instruments in so many butcherings, torn out by a public executioner with a pair of red-hot pincers, and after that their bodies were thrown alive into a fire. Elizabeth's dwarf Fisco was decapitated and afterwards drained of blood and then burnt. So he's not coming back in the sequel.
Fisco was a dwarf?
Yes, he was. I thought that was a fun reveal at the end.
Well, so in her entourage, she has 2 or 3 witches.
She has an eclectic group of people.
And a dwarf that helps her.
She was very open-minded.
A dwarf that helps her dispose of bodies?
Although Elizabeth repeatedly denied her guilt and petitioned to appear before the court many times, her pleas were ignored, thanks to a letter-writing campaign led by her powerful family and the machinations of Count Thurzo.
Wait, so, they're saying, hey, you murdered a bunch of people.
And she's like, I can tell you I didn't.
And, you're going to court, and he's like, no. I'm not doing that.
No, she wasn't allowed in court to defend herself. She was under house arrest. Thanks to a letter-writing campaign, Count Thurzo, she was sentenced with the words, "You are like a wild animal. You are in the last months of your life. You do not deserve to breathe the air on earth, nor to see the light of the Lord. You shall disappear from this world and shall never reappear in it again. The shadows will envelop you, and you will find time to repent your bestial life. And Elizabeth was condemned to life imprisonment in her own castle, but it's not as nice as that might sound.
Right. So, oh, you're forced to live in this castle that you were already.
Stonemasons were instructed to wall Elizabeth into her cell in her castle. She was to live in a single walled up room with only a small opening for food to be passed through. 4 gibbets were built on the corners of the castle, empty, but to demonstrate to the peasants that justice had been done, like a bat signal. On the 31st of July, 1614, Countess Elizabeth Bathory dictated her last will and testament to 2 priests. She left everything to her children. What a loving mother. 1 month later, 4 years after her imprisonment, a curious guard approached her cell to try and get a look at the infamous Countess. Even at the age of 54, she was said to be one of the most beautiful women in all of Europe. The guard looked in through the door slot, but there was no movement. Then he saw a figure on the bed lying face down. The Blood Countess was dead. Legend has it she was starved of virgin blood, which is, of course, kind of well, of course she died. She couldn't just survive on food. She needed virgins. Her body was intended to be buried in the church in the local town, but the local inhabitants found it, not surprisingly, abhorrent that she would be placed in hallowed ground, and so her body was moved to the local town of Exed, the original Bathory seat and the place of her childhood. So let's get into some of the diverging opinions on what could and could not have happened. There is, of course, the element of it being politically motivated. You want to seize the castles, you want to not have to pay back your debts, as we talked about in the episode about King Baldwin and the Order of St. Lazarus. A lot of the Templars were scattered by the King of France, who did not want to pay his debts back to the Crusaders, and the Crusaders themselves had accumulated a decent amount of wealth at that point.
Yeah, but the bodies that were being
So
reported and the ledger in her handwriting.
there were people who claimed that it wasn't her handwriting, like there wasn't forensic science the way that we think of it now. Um, and the one person's claim was that there was that the bodies they found were not killed there, but they were actually the people who had lived in that area before the land had been settled, before the castle had been built. So they said all the buried bodies were just people who died on the battlefield of defending the land. There was one person who she was a historian. Hang on, I want to make sure I get her name correct. So there was this researcher, Dr. Bailey, who believes that Elizabeth was actually a radical feminist who smuggled books to women, and that's why she was persecuted with false allegations. However, that professor first discovered about Elizabeth Bathory reading a book in a library she was working at, so I believe that may be a little bit of projected fan fiction. It would make for a wonderful story, but I don't think that there's any evidence of it in fact. And as Miranda Twist, the author of the most evil men and women in history, for which much of this was the words were taken from, although the research I did was aside from this, says that the truth probably lies somewhere in between. It was probably exaggerated because, like we know from like the Salem witch trials, exaggeration and what is finally written in history may not actually be precisely what transpired. And but what we can talk about is the fact that this legacy inspired Sheridan Le Fanu to write Carmilla, which is the original popular vampire character before Dracula, about a lesbian vampire who wants to suckle the blood of her victim. It's obviously been the source of many sensual interpretations. And also, but there's other characters like Lady Dimitrescu from the Resident Evil franchise. The fact that there is someone inspired by this woman in the Castlevania franchise as well. There's several people who are just interpretations of her story. And on top of all that, there's the fact that just most modern female like vampires and the way that it was cemented, and the fact that this likely inspired a lot of what Bram Stoker was even writing about. This is a foundational element of the vampire mythos: the castle, the fear of the church, which is ultimately what brings her to heel, the bathing in blood, the biting of your victims, the way to keep yourself eternally young, the pale skin, the raven hair. It's the association with witchcraft and all that. These are things that, while technically present in various forms of the vampire legacy before this, are solidified in one singular story and then spread far and wide and becomes so saturated into the zeitgeist that it is, generationally implanted into the consciousness of the way we talk about this
It's so insane
vampire.
because she inspired all these things, and yet from that story, the scariest part of the whole thing is not in vampires at all, which is the fact that no one could do anything. The same thing when people talk about like the Salem witch trials or Jack the Ripper, when they're like trying to take that character and romanticize it.
Hmm.
The reason those are scary is because society did nothing to stop it.
Yeah.
Like the people who should have done something didn't. And that's where the fear comes in.
And I do think that's a very modern interpretation of what the scariest part of this is, because I think if you ask someone in the 1600s about it, they would say the scary thing is being taken into a castle and tortured to death by a vampire woman.
Yeah, well,
Because, we look at it differently now. We're not worried about our bread
yeah,
killing us.
well,
And
even back then, you thought about, waking up, going and harvesting grain, and then going back to home. And
mhm,
like now, we have social media that gives us a sort of a bird's eye view, if skewed and kaleidoscopic,
mhm.
but we're seeing like what the politicians want us to think, like directly from their mouths.
Yeah,
They're
we're
saying,
seeing CEOs, things like that.
yeah.
We've
So we're seeing that from that perspective,
and there was no Luigi Mangione in Transylvania or Vienna at this time.
and somehow he would have had a more ridiculous name if he did exist.
But yeah,
Like,
but the version that our mutual friend Alan had heard was that she was actually like a hospitalier who would aid injured people. That's why there were so many bodies and so much blood there, is because she used to tend to the sick and the needy there. And so you can see that there are wildly diverging theories on
yeah,
what could have been the truth behind this legacy, because I do believe this legacy to be exaggerative. Like, the fact that
yeah,
she died from a lack of virgin blood, I don't think that's true. But the fact that there's a history of epilepsy and mental illness in her family leads to potential signs that, she was just mentally unwell and there was no
yeah.
way to treat it back then or to even diagnose it.
And I know statistically there's undoubtedly exaggeration.
Hmm. Medicine was cruel and unusual.
Yeah, it's
History was
so
not fair. The times were not right. As this book points out in bits that I skipped over, to be a peasant was to be nothing. Even if you could technically work to your freedom, all they would have to say is, "Oh, he stole a cookie. I need 20 more years of labor." And they could do whatever they wanted to you, which is why, if any of this is true, she was able to get away with it for so long. So, I guess with that, I would say, do you believe that this tale of Countess Dracula belongs in a museum?
absolute, if not only just to show what happens when power goes unchecked, it should be shown as a very much a cautionary tale. We're not learning from history, we're doomed to repeat it. So absolutely,
I think this stands not only as, like you were pointing out, a representation of what happens when power goes corrupt and unchecked. Not only is it a call to activism, not only is it based in as much of history as we can find and a very interesting point of conjecture and conversation in what truly happened, sorting fact from what was recorded, it also serves as a literary foundation for our modern understanding of vampirism, of mythologies, and of the classic tropes that now, still in a date to this day, film, television, books, video games, the entire lot of the artistic expression. The story we have here of Elizabeth, of Countess Dracula, has forever shaped the way humans look at evil, the way we look at the unknown, and the way we look at the dark, secretive, evil-based monsters of our world, both literally and figuratively. And I think for that, there is no doubt that this legend belongs in a museum to be studied and sorted as we hopefully gain more information, fact from fiction, and understanding how all of this came to be and what the impact it has had on humanity's interpretations of these themes in fiction. So, thank you for listening. I know this was a longer episode, but it
like,
was certainly an interesting one. So, thank you for listening. Please, enjoy. And if there's any interesting works, any legends, any popular points in history that you think deserve a little bit more attention because they're fascinating or there's something someone doesn't quite know about it, please let us know. We'd love to talk
can
about
we
it.
do upbeat ones next? Like something
Absolutely.
nice?